Have you ever watched someone keep doing the same thing, year after year, and wondered if they were stubborn, or if they just knew something the rest of the world hadn't figured out yet? Let me tell you about Gus Halverson. Gus ran a small irrigation repair shop out of a converted equipment shed on the edge of Meade County, Kansas. The shed sat about 40 yards back from the county road, behind a rust gate that he never bothered to lock. There was no sign. Never had been. People who needed him already knew where he was, and people who didn't need him had no reason to stop. He had been fixing center pivot irrigation systems since 1987. Not the electronics, not the GPS guidance boxes or the variable rate controllers that the big dealers pushed. Gus fixed the mechanical heart of the thing. The gearboxes, the drive shafts, the tower, alignment brackets, the span cables, the reducer assemblies that kept the whole quarter-mile arm turning at exactly the right speed, day after day, in 100-degree heat, through lightning storms and early freezes, and the kind of gritty Kansas wind that ground everything it touched into something older and more tired than it used to be. His father had run a similar operation before him, fixing smaller field equipment, and his grandfather before that had been a machinist at a manufacturing plant in Wichita before the plant closed, and the old man moved the family out to the county with nothing but a metal lathe, a drill press, and the kind of patience that people in that part of the country either inherited or never developed at all. Gus had inherited it. His wife, Nora, used to say that patience was just stubbornness wearing a Sunday coat. Gus would laugh at that with her because she was mostly right and he knew it. But there was a difference, he believed, between waiting for something to happen to you and waiting for the right moment to act. Gus had always been the second kind. The farmers in Meade County brought him their pivot problems the same way people in another town might bring a car to a mechanic they trusted. They didn't call ahead most of the time. They'd pull a flatbed up the gravel drive, unload a gearbox wrapped in an old feed sack, set it near the shed door, and if Gus was in the field or at the hardware store, they'd leave a note weighted down with a rock. Sometimes they didn't even leave a note. Gus knew whose gearbox it was by the wear pattern, by the bolts that had been over-tightened on one side, by the particular way a specific farmer always sheared the same shaft because he ran his system at the wrong RPM and had been doing it for 15 years and wasn't going to change. He knew these machines the way a doctor knows a patient who's been coming in since childhood. The brand most of his customers ran was Valley. Valley irrigation pivots had been manufactured out of Hastings, Nebraska since the early 1960s, and by the time Gus had established himself in the county, Valley equipment was everywhere. The gearboxes on the older units, particularly the ones built between 1979 and 1994, used a specific reducer assembly that Valley had sourced from a machining company called Fenwick Industrial, based out of Dodge City. Fenwick made the housings, the worm gears, the bearing races, the input shaft seals, everything that took the motor's torque and translated it into the slow, grinding rotation that moved 60,000 pounds of pipe across a Kansas cornfield at 1/3 of a mile per hour. Fenwick parts were good. They were precise, they were consistent, and for a long time they were available. You could order them through the Valley dealer in Liberal, or you could call Fenwick directly if you needed something specific. Gus had a relationship with a man there named Bill Carver, who understood what field conditions actually did to these parts, as opposed to what the spec sheet said they should do. When Gus called and said the bearing races on the Series 7 reducers were failing at the inner race before they should, Bill Carver would listen, ask questions, and sometimes send modified parts before the official revision was released. That was the world Gus operated in, a world built on specific knowledge, specific relationships, and the mutual understanding that the machines mattered and the people who kept them running mattered, and the crops that depended on those machines mattered most of all. Then, in the spring of 2006, Bill Carver called Gus instead of the other way around. He didn't say much. He said Fenwick had been purchased by a holding company out of Dallas the previous fall. He said the holding company had done an audit and determined that the irrigation components division represented less than 4% of total revenue. He said production was being discontinued at the end of the quarter. He said he was sorry. Gus stood in his shed for a long time after he put down the phone. He wasn't panicking. That was the thing you'd have noticed if you'd been standing there with him. He wasn't pacing or swearing or picking up the phone to call someone else. He was just thinking, running through the numbers the way he'd been quietly running them for the past several years without quite admitting to himself why he was doing it. He knew roughly how many valley pivot systems were running in the county. He knew approximately how often the Series 7 gearboxes needed new reducer assemblies. He knew that the farmers who ran those systems weren't going to replace the whole pivot because the gearbox parts became unavailable. They'd run them until they seized. They'd try to adapt other parts that didn't quite fit. They'd call the valley dealer and get told to upgrade to a new system at a cost that would take a decade to justify. And eventually, some of them would lose yields, and some of them would lose acres, and some of them would lose farms. He knew all of this because he was the one who answered the phone when it happened. Gus spent the next 3 weeks calling every valley dealer and equipment reseller he could find between Kansas and Nebraska. He wasn't asking for their current inventory. He was asking specifically about old Fenwick stock, parts that had been sitting on shelves for years, the slow-moving items that no dealer liked to carry, but none of them had gotten around to disposing of. Some dealers hung up on him. Some told him they'd checked and had nothing. A few of them had partial boxes of seals or loose bearing races and were happy to get rid of them at cost. And one dealer in a small town outside of Dodge City told him, almost as an afterthought, that he had a back room he hadn't really gone through since 2001, and he'd be willing to take a look if Gus wanted to drive down. Gus drove down. The back room turned out to be more of a back warehouse. There were wooden shelving units along every wall, floor to ceiling, and cardboard boxes labeled in handwriting that had faded to gray. Some of them were Fenwick boxes. Many of them were Fenwick boxes. The dealer, a man named Aldrich, who was about 70 and clearly didn't know exactly what he had back there, watched with mild interest as Gus moved through the rows, pulling boxes, checking part numbers against the handwritten list he'd brought with him. It took most of a Saturday. When Gus came back out into the main building, he had a list of everything in that warehouse that matched his specifications. He handed it to Aldrich and told him what he'd pay for all of it. Aldrich looked at the number and said, "You serious?" Gus said he was. Aldrich said, "That's a lot of parts nobody's been asking for." Gus said, "They will be." He rented a flatbed from a place in Dodge City, loaded everything that afternoon and the next morning, and drove it back to Meade County. He stacked it in a corner of his shed under a tarp and didn't tell anyone what he'd done. Now here is the part that takes a particular kind of person to understand. Most people in Gus's position, if they'd made that drive, bought that inventory, hauled it home, would have felt like they'd solved the problem. They would have told a few farmers about it, set up a little side business selling parts, and ridden it out until the supply ran dry. Gus had no intention of running dry. He called a machinist named Theodore Vance, who ran a small job shop in Pratt, Kansas, about 90 miles northeast. Gus had known Theodore for years. Not well, but well enough to know that Theodore was the kind of machinist who found precision interesting rather than tedious. Gus drove out to Pratt with 3 of the Fenwick reducer assemblies wrapped in cloth and set them on Theodore's workbench without saying anything. Theodore turned them over in his hands for a few minutes. Then he asked what Gus needed. Gus said he needed to know whether Theodore could make these, not approximate them, not produce something close enough that would fail in 3 seasons, actually make them to spec, with the right material hardness and the right surface finish on the gear teeth, so that a farmer running a 1988 Valley pivot in a Kansas sandstorm would never know the difference. Theodore was quiet for a moment. He asked where the original parts had come from. Gus told him Fenwick was done. Theodore nodded slowly. He said he'd need one to fully disassemble. He said it would take him some time to work out the tooling. He said he'd call Gus when he had something to show him. That was in late 2006. The first parts Theodore produced came back to Gus in early 2008. They didn't pass. The worm gear tooth profile was slightly off. Not by much, but enough that under load the wear pattern would accelerate. Gus knew this because he'd sectioned one of the original Fenwick parts and built a simple test rig in his shed to measure contact patterns. He drove back to Pratt, showed Theodore the results, and they talked through the tooling adjustment for 2 hours over bad coffee. The second run came back in the fall of 2008. Gus ran them on 3 separate systems through the irrigation season, checked them at 30-day intervals, and pulled them after 6 months for inspection. The wear was nominal, the surface finish was right. The bearing fits were within tolerance. He called Theodore and told him to set up for production. Now, while all of this was happening, the farmers in Meade County were experiencing exactly what Gus had predicted. The Valley dealer in Liberal had confirmed what everyone already suspected. Fenwick components for the older units were discontinued. The new replacement assemblies didn't fit the pre-1995 tower boxes without modification, and the cost of retrofitting an entire system made the dealer's eyes light up in a way that made farmers nervous. A man named Beaumont, large operation southeast of town, ran 9 pivots, 7 of them the older Valley units, had been the first one to call the Liberal dealer and come away with a quote that made him sit in his truck in the dealer parking lot for 10 minutes before he was ready to drive again. He called Gus that evening. Gus told him to bring in the gearbox that was showing wear. Beaumont said, "You can find parts?" Gus said, "I can fix it." He did not explain the rest, not yet. There's something worth pausing on here. Gus had spent 2 years and a meaningful amount of his own money building a solution to a problem that hadn't fully arrived yet. He'd bought inventory. He'd driven to Pratt a dozen times at least. He'd built test rigs. He'd run seasons of real-world validation on parts that most people didn't even know were going to be needed. He did all of this without advertising it, without telling the farmers what he was building, without asking for anything in advance. Ask yourself, would you have done that? Would you have invested that kind of time and money on a problem that hadn't fully materialized, on a bet that the need would come, on the belief that when it did, you'd want to be ready rather than scrambling? Most people wouldn't. Most people wait until the problem is on fire before they start looking for water. Gus had been carrying water for 2 years. By 2010, word had moved through the county the way word moves in places where people know each other. Slowly, specifically, and without exaggeration. Gus could fix the old Valley gearboxes. He had parts. Not parts cobbled together from something else. Actual parts. And if you needed a full reducer assembly rebuilt, the turnaround was a week, maybe 10 days if Theodore was backed up. The Valley dealer in Liberal tried to figure out where Gus was getting his supply. He eventually stopped trying to figure it out and started sending customers to Gus for the older units because it was easier than listening to farmers complain about retrofit quotes. In 2011, a farmer from Meade County showed up at Gus's shed with a gearbox in the back of his truck and a story about driving 4 hours because 3 other shops had told him the parts didn't exist. He'd found Gus through a man who ran pivots in Meade County, who'd heard about him from a dealer in Kinsley, who'd gotten the information from someone at a co-op meeting in Greensburg. Gus fixed the gearbox. He sent the man home with 2 spare bearing races and a handwritten note with his phone number on it. The man from Meade County called back 6 months later with 4 gearboxes. Then there were calls from Colorado, then from Nebraska, then from a farm manager in the Texas Panhandle who oversaw irrigation systems for 3 different landowners and had been losing sleep over the reducer problem for the better part of a year. Gus talked to him for 45 minutes on a Tuesday evening, asked him to describe the wear pattern in detail, and told him exactly what he'd need and what it would cost. The farm manager said, "How do you have these parts?" Gus said, "Because I went and got them before everyone else needed them." There was a pause on the line. The farm manager said, "Are you going to run out?" Gus said no, and he meant it. Because by then, Theodore's shop in Pratt had produced 3 complete production runs of the Fenwick spec reducer components. Theodore had hired a second machinist specifically to handle the valley work. Gus had organized the parts inventory in a way that would have impressed a supply chain manager. Bin locations, reorder triggers, inspection records. Every part logged with the run it came from and the date it was checked. His daughter, Wendy, who had studied accounting at Kansas State and come back to help run the administrative side of the shop, had built him a simple database that tracked which parts had gone to which systems in which county. If a specific batch ever showed unusual wear, they could identify every unit it had gone to. This was not a man improvising. This was a man who had built a system. A small system, a quiet system, a system that would never appear in any business magazine or get mentioned at any industry conference, but a system nonetheless. Nora used to watch him in the evenings when he'd be at the kitchen table going through his parts logs, and she'd shake her head in that way she had that meant she was impressed, but wasn't going to say so directly. She'd told him back in 2006 after the call from Bill Carver that she thought he was overreacting. She'd said maybe the Valley dealer would find another supplier. She'd said maybe farmers would just upgrade their systems. Gus had listened to her, considered it, and driven to Dodge City anyway. She brought that up sometimes, later when people asked how the business had changed. She'd tell the story of Gus sitting at the kitchen table that evening, quiet and still, and she'd say, "I thought he was panicking. He was planning." By 2014, Gus's operation had evolved into something that would have been difficult to explain to someone who wasn't familiar with how rural equipment ecosystems actually worked. He wasn't a parts dealer in any conventional sense. He didn't have a catalog. He didn't have a website for most of that period. What he had was a phone number that had been passed, farmer to farmer, across 4 states, attached to a reputation that said, "If your old Valley gearbox is dying and you've been told there's no fix, call Gus Halverson in Meade County." He'd also started taking on 1 or 2 younger mechanics each year, not as formal apprentices, not with any program or paperwork, but in the way that knowledge has always been transmitted in places like this. A young man would start coming around to help with turnaround work, and gradually, over months, Gus would start explaining things. Why the Series 7 worm gear failed at the inner race before the outer. Why the original Fenwick bearing tolerances were tighter than the spec suggested they needed to be. And why that extra precision mattered after 10,000 hours in the field. How to read wear patterns on gear teeth the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Not just seeing what was there, but understanding what had caused it and what it predicted. A young man named Calvin Stroud had started showing up in 2012. He was 22, grew up on a wheat farm outside Fowler, and had the kind of mechanical intuition that was either innate or built so early it was impossible to separate from personality. Gus recognized it within a week. He didn't say anything about it. He just started leaving the more diagnostic work on Calvin's side of the bench. Calvin stayed. He was still there in 2016 when Gus's right knee started giving him trouble on the concrete floor in winter, and it was Calvin who began taking the longer drives to Pratt to see Theodore, to the Meade County farms, and the Texas Panhandle manager who now sent a regular consolidated order twice a year. Gus didn't hand the operation to Calvin. He handed the knowledge to Calvin, and the operation followed naturally, the way it always does when the knowledge is real. There is something that the farming communities in western Kansas understood about Gus Halverson that is difficult to quantify but easy to recognize when you see it. He was not a businessman in the way that word usually implies. He did not optimize for margin. He did not create artificial scarcity. He did not turn a supply crisis into an opportunity to extract maximum value from people who had no alternatives. He set his prices at a level that covered his costs, compensated Theodore fairly, and left enough margin to build the next season's inventory. Farmers who were in a tight year knew they could call and work something out. He never advertised that. He didn't need to. What he'd built, without ever naming it or presenting it in those terms, was a form of infrastructure. The kind of infrastructure that doesn't appear on any county map or state economic development report, but that exists in the practical sense because without it, real things stop working. Crops don't get irrigated. Fields go dry in August. Farms that have been in families for 3 generations face decisions they shouldn't have to face. Gus had placed himself, quietly and deliberately, in the gap between what the corporate supply chain provided and what the land actually required. He'd done it before anyone told him to, before anyone asked him to, before anyone else even recognized that the gap was going to open. Let me tell you what happened in the summer of 2017, because this is the part of the story that most people don't expect. A representative from a regional agricultural equipment distributor out of Wichita drove down to Meade County to meet with Gus. The distributor had been trying, for about 2 years, to source reliable replacement components for the older Valley units in their service territory. They'd found a couple of suppliers who could approximate the parts, but the failure rates in the field were higher than anyone wanted to admit, and the complaint calls were wearing on their service department. Someone on their team had eventually traced the root of the problem back to Meade County, to a shed behind a rusted gate, to a man who had been quietly supplying field-proven parts across 4 states without ever contacting a single distributor. The representative, a careful, professional man who was good at his job and knew it, drove out to Gus's shed and introduced himself and explained what he was looking for and what his company might be able to offer in terms of a distribution arrangement. Gus listened to the whole presentation. Then he asked a few questions. Specific questions about volume commitments, about quality inspection protocols, about what would happen to pricing if the distribution relationship required a margin increase. He asked whether the company had ever terminated a supplier arrangement on short notice. He asked this last question in a tone that was completely neutral, and the representative answered it honestly, which Gus respected. He told the representative he'd think about it. He called Theodore that evening. They talked for an hour and a half. Theodore pointed out that a distribution arrangement would require him to significantly expand production capacity, which meant capital investment, which meant risk. Gus said he understood. He also said that if they didn't grow, eventually someone with more resources would figure out what they'd figured out and build a competing supply. Theodore said he'd thought about that too. They agreed to go back to the Wichita distributor with a counter-proposal. The counter-proposal had several components that were non-negotiable. First, the quality inspection protocol would remain under Gus and Theodore's control, not the distributor's. Second, pricing would be set on a cost-plus basis that Gus would determine, not negotiated down to a margin the distributor preferred. Third, the arrangement would not restrict Gus from continuing to sell directly to farmers who had been his customers before the distribution relationship existed. The distributor pushed back on the first 2 points. Gus held. The distributor accepted the arrangement with minor modifications. The distribution relationship began in early 2018. Within 18 months, the parts that Gus and Theodore had been producing for 12 years were available through the distributor's network in Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, and Oklahoma. The farmers who'd been calling Gus directly still called Gus directly. The farmers who were newer to the problem, who didn't know who to call, could now find the parts through the dealer they already worked with. The demand turned out to be larger than either Gus or Theodore had estimated. Not enormously larger, but steadily, consistently larger. Theodore hired a third machinist, then a fourth. He bought a new CNC grinder that allowed him to hold tolerances he'd previously had to achieve through hand finishing. The quality went up. The failure rates in the field, already low, dropped further. Calvin Stroud, by then running the day-to-day of the Meade County shop, started getting calls from dealers who wanted to understand the diagnostic methodology. How did you know which gearboxes could be rebuilt versus which ones needed full replacement? What was the inspection protocol? Calvin answered those calls the same way Gus had always answered questions, directly, specifically, without protecting the knowledge as if sharing it would diminish it. Nora Halverson passed away in February 2019 after a short illness. She was 63. Gus took 2 weeks off, which was more time than he'd ever taken off before, and then he came back to the shed. Calvin didn't ask him why. He understood that the work was part of how Gus was built, the same way the shed was part of how the farm was built, and some structures you maintain not because you choose to, but because they're what you are. There were farmers at Nora's service who had driven 4 hours. There were farmers who had known Gus for 30 years and still felt, standing in that church, that they didn't fully understand what he'd built or how. They only knew that when the problem had come, and the problem always came, sooner or later, for all of them, Gus had been ready. He's still in that shed. The gate is still rusted. There's still no sign. On the south wall of the shed, where Gus used to keep a hand-drawn diagram of the Series 7 reducer assembly for reference, there's now a framed photograph. It's a picture of the workbench in Theodore's shop in Pratt, taken sometime around 2009, showing the first successful production run of parts laid out in a row. They're machined components. Nothing visually dramatic about them. Nothing that would mean anything to someone who didn't know what they were looking at. Calvin put the frame there without asking. He thought Gus should know he'd done it. Gus looked at it for a moment when he noticed it. Then he picked up the phone and called a farmer in Scott County who was 2 weeks into irrigation season with a gearbox that had been making sounds it shouldn't make. He had the part. He'd always had the part. That's the thing about a man like Gus Halverson. The world doesn't hand you notice when the thing you've been preparing for is about to arrive. It doesn't send a letter. It doesn't make an announcement. It just arrives one morning in the bed of somebody's flatbed truck, and you either have what they need or you don't. Gus always had what they needed. And that, in the end, is the only kind of ready that matters.